You're listening to Economics Detective Radio. My guest today is George Tridimas of Ulster University. George, welcome to Economics Detective Radio.
It's nice to talk to you, Garrett. Thank you for the invitation.
So we've done multiple episodes on this show about the early modern period and the birth of the Industrial Revolution and modern economic growth in England and in the Low Countries. But what we're going to talk about today is a related question, which is, why didn't that happen in other times and places throughout history? Other times when you might have thought that there was an industrial revolution just around the corner. George works on, has written multiple papers about the economic history of Greece, ancient Greece, which was an extremely prosperous civilization in the 4th century BCE, and but did not manage to produce anything like the Industrial Revolution. So that's our broad topic for today. George, how about you start by giving the audience some background? Tell me where was Greece as a civilization in the 4th century, in the golden age of ancient Greece, and what would we recognize about it economically?
Economically, a few things will be recognized, like some form of market. Certainly, we will recognize property rights, well-protected property rights, and we will recognize things like complicated contracts, especially lending money to the merchants who were bringing corn from the Black Sea to Athens and from Africa to Athens. So there are various trappings that we would call characteristics of the modern economy. Equally, or perhaps more importantly, the researchers from the 19th century onwards have looked at ancient Greece and Rome and said, those guys there might have been very good in this and that thing, architecture, philosophy, the law, the Romans, of course, and the poetry and philosophy, but their economy was primitive. In fact, their economy was not rational. So for a long time, the idea was that neither ancient Greece nor ancient Rome had rational economic agents. Over the last 20 years or so, it seems to me that the pendulum has swung the other way around, and a number of economic historians now say, no, it was not like that. In fact, they were rational given the circumstances and so on. Of course, we have questions, what do you mean by rationality and this and that and the other. Rationality for the older school meant that they were not interested in profit maximization. They were interested in maximizing their status, which was left actually as a vague notion what status meant. And another issue which apparently meant that there was no rationality was a norm of reciprocity between friends. So you can actually raise money to have enough money for your daughter's dowry, but you don't pay interest rate on that. Or actually, if you pay an interest rate, then you are expected to reciprocate later on when your friend's daughter was going to get married, and things like this. So it was not really a market-driven economy. This old view, the primitivist view of the economy, or sometimes called the view of the substantive economy only, is debated or has been debated, and I presume it will be debated. The pendulum may again swing the other way around, and so on. My research actually came to look at the kind of observation, came to the realization that if Greece has actually a market economy, and if property rights were well protected, and if it had actually competitive economic and more importantly political system, all those things which for the institutionalists, modern institutionalists, are so important for the Industrial Revolution and development, then why Greece, ancient Greece, became the kind of the dog who did not bark at night? What happened? What was it? So that was the motivation of that piece of research. The economists, modern actually economic historians, are telling us that the economy was actually rational. It was market-driven, and indeed it achieved high rates of growth, something which had not been witnessed before, or it had witnessed actually a long, long time ago, basically in the Iron Age. and it was only a short window during the Iron Age. Then there was the so-called ancient Dark Ages, and we have from 800 BC approximately to 300 BCE the efflorescence of Greece, where there was substantial economic development. So there was substantial economic development. It was the rates of growth achieved are calculated to be more or less compatible with what actually the low countries achieved before the Industrial Revolution. So why didn't do any better? Why actually there was no takeoff after that? That's the question.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think a lot of people sort of implicitly, accidentally subscribe to a Whig theory of history, the idea that things get just bigger and better as time goes on in a sort of mechanical, automatic way. But, if you're sitting in the year 300 BC and, you're looking and you're in Athens and it looks like things have been growing and getting better for centuries and you maybe have not a lot of reason to think that they won't continue to get better.
That's right.
The question is, why would that be wrong to someone sitting in 300 BC when it would be entirely correct to someone sitting in 1750?
Yes. Can I just give you a couple of indicative actually figures?
Sure.
In about 800 BC, the population of what is Greece, modern Greece, it was calculated, estimates, was about 0.7 million. Come 300, and that was actually triple. Are talking about actually tripling population over 500 years. It was not just actually an increased population. If we take that consumption per capita, if we take the base value of 100 at 800 BCE, then by 300 BCE, it was anything between 2 or 2.5 of the original figure. So I'm talking about a growth or considerable growth, slow growth, but it was a growth over time. So if that growth is calculated at about, let's say, 0.15% per capita per year, that actually compares better than the Roman Empire, which was 0.10. And it's not actually that far away from Holland in the period to 16th century to the beginning of the 19th century at about 0.2%. Very small percentages, but if you accumulate them over 100 years, they are substantial. Of course, they pale if you look at the UK in the 19th century, where the rate of growth is 1.2% per year. But the point is that before the Industrial Revolution, there was what has been called the Greek efflorescence. It did not lead to Industrial Revolution, however. So why? If we look at the modern theories of development, then we start from what is really the proximate factors of our growth, and we have the usual actually mix there that growth of output depends on the factors of production, therefore land, capital, labor, and technology. Land is more or less fixed. Yes, we can claim land, but also you lose forests and the like. So you take land as fixed. Then why is there growth? There is growth in per capita terms because you have more capital and better technologies. Therefore, you've got the TFA, total factor production, increasing and the like. Fine. Then there is a question, is this really what causes growth? That causes the growth of output. But what is fundamentally at work? What are the factors which drive the increase in capital and technology and so on? So modern theories come up with, obviously, the idea, it is just random factors, good luck. We don't really have a theory if you start from luck and you end up with luck. You don't really say much more than that. So the three fundamental factors, or the three fundamental causes are institutions, geography, and culture. And there is that long-going actually debate, which one is the most important, or can you actually isolate one of them and say this is the factor and so on. Now, it just happens that the economic historians who look at the performance of the ancient Greek economy and say, it was good, efflorescence took place, the economy did very well, the standard of living increased tremendously, and so on and so forth, usually say they had the right institutions and the right culture. And the right institutions means that they had more or less competitive politics, democracy, and the like. After all, democracy was invented in ancient Greece, competition between the different city-states of ancient Greece, and the right culture, a robust culture, which also fostered competition and doing better than my neighbor, and eventually actually having, in aggregate terms, a better standard of living. So if the culture was right, and if the institutions were right, why they failed to take the next step? So part of my research is looking into it. What was actually wrong with institutions, if anything? What was wrong with the culture, if anything? And how about geography? Was geography important? I mean, after all, Greece is rather it's situated in a poor part of the world in terms of agricultural resources and in terms of mineral wealth. So you may start from the point you don't really need the good geography if you can trade. You can always actually move into manufacturing. Greece did not have an industrial revolution.
Yeah. Yeah. So let's talk more about that, the institutional side of things. Ancient Greece had, I forget the exact or the number, but just a staggering number of independent city states with their own different governments and
figures,
experimenting with new forms of governments.
Yes.
Yeah.
If we look at the Greek world, not just mainland Greece, we calculate about 1,100 of them. Staggering number, as you said, 1,100 independent city-states.
1,100. So I've heard people argue that is the competition between these many different states created an environment for them to innovate with respect to their institutions and their creating things like democracy and various forms of republic, but also at the other end, sort of top down command and control style institutions and everything in between.
Absolutely.
So can you talk a little bit about the institutions developed during this time?
Yes, absolutely correct about the competition between them. In fact, there is a lot of work from Josiah Ober of Stanford on your side of the Atlantic, and on my side of the Atlantic, a name which comes up to mind is that of Morgan Hansen from Denmark. Put a lot of work into identifying the number of cities and how they were governed and so on and so forth. The ancient Greeks thought of three primordial formats of governing. One is government by one, that's a kingship. Then there is the government by few, that's the aristocracy. And then there is the government by the many, and that's a democracy. And you can have corruptions. The king may become a tyrant, the few, the aristocrats may become oligarchs, and democracy may end up with the rule of the mob. So all these actually corruptions are to be avoided. By the 5th century or so, we have actually democracy in Athens. It's an interesting question how democracy, actually, what democracy meant, and how it emerged, how it differs from our modern democracy in a way. Are the two democracies at all related? Are they sisters? Are they sisters from the same father with different mothers? Or is it a convenient word that we use? This comparative study is actually quite exciting. The democracy in Athens died in 322 with the Macedonian expansion, the Macedonian Alexander the Great, who conquered the Persian Empire and so on. After his death, democracy actually declines and eventually disappears. And with the decline of democracy, you also have the decline of the economic efflorescence of prosperity of mainland Greece. The center of gravity, politically and economically, was moved away from Athens, and eventually it was fragmented to different places in Asia, Egypt, of course, and Rome took over about 150 years later. And of course, Rome actually established the republic, not democracy as such.
So this could be an argument for democracy as a driving factor in the economic growth of ancient Greece, and the end of democracy as potentially a causal factor in why that growth didn't take off after 300.
This is a correct reading. It is not the only reading, but yes, I think you can
Hmm.
actually draw that conclusion. The democracy actually drove economic prosperity, and the fall of democracy implied actually economic decline too. The correlation is there. Causation is very difficult to establish as
Hmm.
usual, but the correlation is undoubtedly there. I would be a little bit
Yeah,
hesitant to say it is 100% a causative link.
I've heard it kind of argued that although Alexander, somewhat like Napoleon and the French Revolution, Alexander may have quashed democracy in Greece, but he also spread that culture and those sort of ideas all over the world by conquest. But I suppose the evidence is that wasn't if this is the causal factor, then spreading those ideas was not as valuable as keeping them actually intact.
Yes, I think you're right.
Hmm.
Yes, you're right.
So let's talk about some of the other factors. So in addition to the democratic institutions that places like Athens had, you also discuss the role of energy costs
Yes.
in this whole story of the initial growth, but then the lack of an industrial revolution. So, what did the Greeks rely on for energy, and why was it insufficient?
Let me put that into perspective. First of all, there is a distinct viewpoint about why the industrial revolution started in England, and the reason was that the theory goes that it is deep down a combination of geographical and economic factors. Geography is really the wealth of coal deposits in England, and at a time of very expensive labor, it was almost inevitable that enterprising investors would think of ways to substitute the cheap sources of energy, coal, into expensive labor. So that is the one way of thinking about the Industrial Revolution, especially why the Industrial Revolution started in England rather than France or Germany or I don't know where else. So if we were to look at actually if we were to believe in that story, then what does that story imply for ancient Greece? So we start from the point of view that production, transportation, indeed, actually running a household, cooking, warming the household, and lighting the household requires energy. So, what were the energy sources in ancient Greece? The ancient Greeks, as well, probably the entire ancient world, actually relied on animate sources of energy. It relied, first of all, on natural phenomena like the sun, the water, the power of the water, and the wind. And animate sources meant wood, charcoal, specifically, ox, horse, and human labor. Now, ancient Greece, specifically ancient Greece, I'm talking about mainland Greece where democracy actually was born and so on, is a place where the soil is unsuitable for horses and it is not rich in forests, it is not rich in coal either. So they could rely on sun, they could rely on water up to a point, they could rely on wind. Water, actually, what do you mean by that? The water mill was actually invented in antiquity, but far too late to have a big effect on the economy. The water mill is used late in the Hellenistic period after the fall of the democracy. So the timing is wrong. The sun, yes, the sun is there. Wind is there, and that meant that transportation had to rely on the power of the wind and the power of those who were rowing the ships. And they did pretty well on that. But pretty well really meant that going up and down what is the Aegean Sea, the eastern basin of the Mediterranean Sea, was taking at minimum 5 days. And usually on the way back, it was taking 2 weeks because of the right wind. Or if you had to rely on manpower, then the ship could not simply cross the sea on a straight line. It had to go from place to place so that you could feed the crew. You could feed actually the rowers and spend the night and so on and so forth. Navigation instruments were primitive at the time. What is the problem with those issues? The problem is that you cannot store the sun, you cannot store the wind. So there is an element of, if you like, great variance there. you cannot be sure what exactly is going to happen, how long the trip is going to take, how long is the journey to bring the cargoes, and so on and so forth. So they did pretty well. If you think that the Athenians needed to import probably, at a minimum, 1/3 of the corn that they were using, up to, well, could have been a lot more. They had to actually to import it from the Black Sea or from Africa. Then they did pretty well for a place which had a population of about 150,000 people. Could have been about 250,000 people at the time of the Great Prosperity. So the problem really is that you can generate energy, but you cannot store it. So when you generate that energy, you have to consume it. How different is that from actually burning petrol? How different is that from burning coal and so on? The other animate source that they were using was wood. Now, there are not very many good woodlands in Greece. They're actually in Macedonia, in the northern part of Greece, but not where the democratic city-states were. And the problem with wood is that you've got to manage the forest actually very carefully. You cut down some trees, then you use those trees first of all to make charcoal. So from every it takes a lot of wood to produce a reliable source of energy for cooking, for warming the house, and of course for metalworks. Now, if you use charcoal instead of actual coal, you cannot produce the very high heat that you need for steel. And therefore, one of the main materials of the Industrial Revolution was missing from ancient Greece. They just could not produce steel. So if we look at the technological improvement, the technological actually progress in Greece, in ancient Greece, they seem to have been pretty good. They actually, we know from a variety of sources that they had been able to invent things which were like steam engines, very, very large ships as well, and a number of gadgets which would actually shame modern engineers. But the steam engines that they had invented could not be relied for anything else but simply being toys, if you like, opening gates and nothing else. They could not be relied for transport purposes. Why? Because the tubing could not be put into place and fixed in view of the fact that they did not have steel screws or any steel pipe or anything actually which could make the whole engine fixed into a place. It would blow up. So they could, or they were in a position to invent things. They could not put those inventions into industrial production.
So they did have steam engine technology. They just didn't have the metallurgy to complement it.
They were aware, or at least some engineer, I can actually give you names if you so wish, an engineer called Heron of Alexandria. From his writings, we understand that he was fully aware of properties at vacuum, of what is the possibilities of steam and all those things. Simply that could not be put into practical use in the way that it was put a number of centuries later. So it's a combination of things. You don't have actually coal. You do not produce. You cannot have a reliable source of energy. You do not have a reliable source of energy, so that sort of you switch it on and off at will. You cannot produce actually the high heat that you need for steel. Therefore, you cannot go into metallurgical work that you could go during the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution cannot start like that.
Wow. So it. I mean, it's just such a shame that one can imagine here we are 200-300 years after our industrial revolution and living in much greater with a much higher standard of living and much greater wealth than at any previous point in human history. It really makes you wonder what would have happened if we were instead 2,300 years out from a different industrial revolution, and for it to have been curtailed by something as simple as just not having the energy sources necessary to create steel. It's an unfortunate shame. So that's one of the big issues. So we've talked about institutions. There's some plausible connection between the death of democracy and the death of sustained economic growth in ancient Greece. Then
Yes,
there's this
yes,
energy
that's right.
issue that put a cap on certain technological developments that require the high heat to produce steel and the all the technologies that need a strong metal like steel and can't be done with something like bronze. The third issue you talk about is culture. I know this is something that Deirdre McCloskey has
I'm sorry.
emphasized.
Can I,
Mhm.
before we go to culture, I just don't want to. I
Mhm.
want to say something more about the energy. Actually, there's another issue here.
Okay.
The how expensive it was actually to move things about, to move actually goods about. The A few things are taken for granted those days. I mean, if you have you can sort of load a train, and the train will carry the goods pretty cheaply and reliably where you want them to go. Now, overland transportation was very expensive in the ancient times. It There is a study which by a guy called Tainter back in I think it's about 30 years old that side now or something like that, and he calculated that the a wagon of a wagon load of wheat would actually double in value with a journey or an overland journey of about 500 kilometers. So
Mhm.
500 kilometers is yeah, it's a fair distance, right? But if you think how big the Roman Empire was, the very expensive transport of goods meant that you could not have those trade networks where you move actually things on a massive scale very quickly and very reliably, rather cheaply, that we have had after the Industrial Revolution. So the only thing which actually could be profitably exchanged over land were things which would be put into very small storage. So you would have a thriving trade in perfumes, but not in other things which you would need in bulk. Bulk trade was taking place through through the water, and water really means the ships in ancient Greece, and that meant either reliance on the winds or human rowers, human powered rowers. So you have very expensive energy, and you pay the cost for that in terms of industrial production, as well as in transport of everything from agricultural things to building materials to industrial products, if you have any industrial products. So, if you like,
Right.
it's a double whammy. It's not just one thing, so you get a double whammy there.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's part of where geography might come in and
Yes.
actually be helpful because, of course, Greece, if you look at it on a map, it has a lot of coastline relative to its total area, and so for a
Yes.
society like all pre-modern societies based around transportation by water and trade happening across water, that would be advantageous.
Yes, but that also meant that you were restricted in trading with coastal places. Greece doesn't have actually big rivers like the ones that you see in Europe or in America or in Asia. The rivers are actually pretty small. They're not navigable rivers. So navigation really meant you have to go from port to port, the coastline. They did pretty well, but it really meant that it had to come to a point of utmost limit. You could not go any further than that.
Right. Yeah. I mean, the advantage of a river is you can let the current take you all the way to your destination, at least going one direction, and then you could
Yes,
maybe rely on animal power to get back. Have a donkey pull your raft or something like that.
yes,
Um, so the energy issue is this double whammy. You can't do land transportation. You're reliant on water. You're reliant on the inconsistencies of winds. But the Greeks do build a fairly substantial trade network around the Mediterranean.
Absolutely. Yes.
Mhm. And
In a way,
that's
what?
yep.
Yes, they did. But eventually you run into diminishing returns. You cannot take it any further.
Mm-hmm.
You try more, but it is no longer. It doesn't look. The marginal product comes actually to zero at the end of it.
Yeah. So getting on to the culture issue that I started talking about before, Deirdre McCloskey has emphasized the role of changing cultural norms in facilitating the Industrial Revolution in England and the Low Countries, and the idea
Bourgeois
that
evaluation, as you call it.
mhm. Yeah, and the idea that earning wealth and innovating and developing, inventing things, being a middleman or a businessman, those all became respected professions, and they were given more dignity, in at the start of the Industrial Revolution than they had been previously. So my understanding from your work is that kind of culture was not present in ancient Greece. Is that correct?
That is correct. Yes, that is correct. There is, it's quite interesting actually. Culture is probably the most difficult and the most intriguing of all factors. You have the question of how is culture actually transmitted. Let's first of all, what do we mean by culture, right? We mean attitudes and values about the world, about actually the position of humans in the world, expectations that you think that society has upon you, and what you expect from the society. Okay, so it's probably you're going to find as many definitions of culture as individuals who research the issue. But I think what we said here is more or less acceptable. So if we were to look actually at the ancient Greeks, then there are a few cultural traits which I think did not help this kind of leap from I feel like a primitive state to the industrial revolution. Attitudes towards self-sufficiency, attitudes to wealth accumulation, and what you may call collectivist attitudes. So, however, whatever I'm going to say here should come with a health warning in the following sense: what we understand as being the culture of the ancients is what we read in the sources from the authors and so on. Now, to a large extent, these authors were actually people, if you like, the upper classes. So we're not really sure whether what they bequeath to us in writing is what actually the common people believed. Sometimes it's difficult to isolate the positive from the normative, and as a result of that, as a result of those doubts, we have researchers who read the same text and come up with different conclusions. So we've got to be very, very careful. Actually, we've got to be our conclusions regarding culture are rather nuanced. We cannot be as unequivocal as we may be with other things, which are easier to measure and easier to discern. So let me say a few things about the idea of self-sufficiency. The starting from economic historians who did not credit the Greeks with market attitudes and economic rationality. The first criticism is that the first thing that they said, which runs against rationality, is that the ancient Greeks had the ideal of being self-sufficient. Self-sufficiency of the city-state, so you don't have to rely on bloody foreigners, and self-sufficiency of the household, the or oikos. So you don't want to rely on the market. You would actually, you are proud if you can feed your family, and you don't need anybody else for that. So this kind of autarky, if you like, closed household economy, closed city-state economy is a positive thing, and as well as something that it has in the writings of the ancients a moral overtone. It was a good thing to be. It is something to which you aspire. Now, whether that is because they wanted it, or because actually or like the older class of aristocrats looked at the Greeks who became rich through trade with disdain, that is a question that we cannot easily resolve. Nevertheless, if you keep that kind of attitude towards self-sufficiency, then capital accumulation becomes difficult. Without capital accumulation, remember what we said before about the proximate factors of growth, you have no growth. Now, this is one idea. There is some very recent work by Bresson, a French economist who is now in the US, and also some economists on this side of the water, maybe my side, from Edinburgh, Harris, and Lewis, who actually debunk the self-sufficiency hypothesis. And they say that the average citizen was not oblivious to profit making and was not detached from the market. Any opportunity to make money was taken. As I said before, it's very difficult actually to say what exactly was holding. Again, if we look at other cultural traits, if we look at attitudes to work towards work and wealth accumulation, the Athenian ideal was one of masculinity, which meant to be brave and to maintain self-employment, not to work in the paid employment of anybody else. Right. So if actually your ideal is that you will self-sustain yourself, then eventually you end up without collecting business expertise. And if we go on and as some people understand that the ancient Greeks actually looked with disdain. In fact, they thought that it was socially inferior to work in the employment of someone else, then obviously you're never going to end up with modern specialization, work specialization, and division of labor. So to that we add the idea that acquiring a man's good is a good thing, but developing a good man is even better. And where exactly do you draw the line? It becomes actually difficult to see a society which will say, okay, profit for the sake of profit, plow the profit back to the production process for more profits and the like. So we end up with a society which lacks business skills and lacks work experience outside the family farm or the family workshop. Again, we accept that with quite a few pinches of salt, not just one. The fourth century, the Athenian fourth century, is a century of commercialism. We understand that you could not possibly have the kind of specializations that we have there. Something like 120 different professions are listed for the Athenian economy. Which is a fair number if you think about the level of economic development at the time. So the economy is actually, you ask the economy, you ask the question, is the economy part of a social network with religious overtones, or is the economy independent of the society and the political game? I don't think that people will agree here on that at all. You have here as many views in favor and an equal number against the disembedded view of the economy, embedded in social structures or disembedded from social structures. So again, I would take that cultural approach with a pinch of salt, whether or not the Athenians had the ancient Greeks and the Athenians, we know more about the Athenians than the rest, had the right approach towards capital accumulation and profit making and capital accumulation.
Right. It's all a very interesting kind of study. It's so hard to figure out what cultures and beliefs were so far in the past, and of course, since the elites were the ones doing the most of the writing, and elites tend to see the sort of economic upstarts, the entrepreneurs, the people who become rich through trade, as sort of encroaching on their social status and damaging existing hierarchies, and you often get a lot of resistance, and you certainly did in the early modern period. So to the extent that that's what we're reading, then we might overestimate how negative attitudes were towards commerce.
Yes, that's right. That's right. Yes. The other thing is that in many respects, the idea of liberalism was missing in ancient Greece. The liberalism, by which I mean that individuals are recognized as self-interested and having rights which cannot be violated by the state or anybody else, and of course that the individual takes precedence over the state. That idea did not exist in ancient Greece. To put it another way, the the ancient Greeks developed the idea of citizenship. But citizenship was not a birthright which was inalienable. It was a legal construction, it was a political creation, and it could be lost. So you could have like a coup, and the coup would disenfranchise half the population. So the idea of citizenship as we understand it today, after actually basically following the Enlightenment, it was missing. There was no Lockean idea of the individual in entering a kind of of contract with the state. And there are some good examples of that. The Athenians and other actually city-states practiced what is known as ostracism, which is the citizens can take a vote to banish someone for a period of 10 years. Banishment meant that the person had to live away from Athens, particular radius actually outside of Athens, significant one given the transport costs and so on, and the number of days it would take. The individual would have no political rights during those 10 years, but the individual would not lose his property. In fact, his family could join him, or the family could bring money to him, and so on and so forth. But the individual was not allowed to be part of the political life. Had no right to take political activity for 10 years after the ostracism. In the modern age, that would be violation of human rights. Another good example, actually, of the illiberal attitude is the famous trial of Socrates and how he was condemned to death. They can be explained rationally, all those issues. I mean, ostracism, which is quite remarkable actually as a way of conducting politics, was a big progress from the time of the politics of the exile and the politics actually of destroying, in fact, killing your opponents. So it was a big step forward from the really ancient times of political competition, conflict ending up with killing the faction which lost the political game. So you may lose, and what happens to you? You are simply actually banished. You go away from the city for 10 years. 10 years is a considerable period of time, so when you come back, you may be completely unable to re-enter politics. That's not the point here. The point is that you do not lose your life if you lose an election, if you lose actually a political competition. But on the other hand, from our modern point of view, it was an illiberal measure. So again, it's a fine line that we've got to draw here to understand attitudes toward liberalism and so on, or illiberalism. But the point remains: insofar as the Industrial Revolution and capitalism and our modern politics and economy is based on the idea of the individual as an individual with inviolable rights, that did not exist in ancient Greece.
Yeah, it's pretty historically unique to have a society where you can win a political contest and not thereafter murder your opponents or kick them out of your state or do really nasty things to them. The idea that you win power and then live in harmony with the people who lost until the next election is it's a pretty hard thing for humans to do, for societies to do. And it's very good for us that we've started doing this and developed the norms necessary to do this, but it's a tenuous balance, and one that, as you point out, they didn't have.
Which again brings us back to the question of what was a democracy like, and I think I'm not actually sort of treading on sensibilities now. The ancient democracy was fundamentally different from the modern democracy. It's I don't know whether it is totally by luck that we call them both democracies, but the conception was different. The ancients thought of democracy as the rule of the demos, and they were not voting for politicians to hold office. They were voting directly on policies, and that makes it a completely different construction from what we have today. In the ancient democracy, you could propose a policy, you could your proposal could lose, or you would win. Your proposal would win, but that did not mean that you won office or you lost office. It was not actually a question of serving in office or winning office at an election. The elections were about actual policies, where the voters were voting for policies rather than individuals. So, to put that in a different way, in the ancient text, there is no mention of things like the president or the prime minister or the executive. That does not exist. The reason is that they were not voting, they were not appointing people to those positions of power. Democracy meant power of the people, and the people decide directly. You could propose a policy, your policy could win. You would be, let's say, your proposals would be winners for year in, year out, but that did not mean that you were serving in office. That did not mean that you were going to be, in one way or another, the representative of the state. You were not. The type of elections that they had were actually only for the military commanders, and that only for about 100 years, only for a century. In the 5th century, the military commanders were also political leaders. In the 4th century, the military commanders who were elected into office, but they were only in office during military operations, otherwise they were not in office. They were not actually political leaders. We've got this kind of like funny incidences where some of the political leaders of the 4th century who proposed policies, sometimes go to war and so on and so forth, served as soldiers under the command of military officers who were elected into office for the military campaign, and they had no position of authority of command in that campaign. So the politician proposes a policy, and then the politician serves as a soldier, not as a commander. So in this respect, the conception of democracy is different from the conception of democracy that we have now.
Right. So not a representative democracy, but you could still have.
It's not a representative democracy.
You could still have someone like Pericles being just being very influential and being able to propose a lot of policies and get them ratified and essentially control life. But he wasn't the president or the prime minister.
Not the prime minister. His sort of a biggest achievement as a politician was that he was elected general for 15 years in a row. Nobody else actually managed that. But he was not really a military commander. We don't really know of him commanding the Athenian army. He was there to propose policy. He had strategic views, but he was not a field commander. He actually commanded the troops in the so-called Battle of Tanagra, but that was not one of the kind of big conflicts that we come across in ancient Athens. But as you said, yes, he was actually someone whose name characterizes a whole era. He was someone who was elected into the office, but when he was proposing policies, he was not proposing policies because of his elected office. He proposed policies as a private individual. Indeed, we have a number of examples where policies are proposed by individuals who are not known otherwise. Both in the 5th century and the 4th century, we have examples where legislation was passed because interested parties, meaning private citizens, proposed the policy and the assembly accepted it. So you didn't have to be in office in order actually to propose policy.
Yeah. So
anybody proposed policy. Could propose. Not everybody did, obviously, but everybody had the right to propose a policy or to propose amendments, for that matter.
Yeah, there's something very appealing about it, and we occasionally have ballot measures and referendums and stuff that reflect that, but they're not the main driver of policies by any extent, by any stretch. In our modern representative democracies. I think the elephant in the room, the thing we haven't talked about, is warfare. Just how incredibly much. I mentioned how all these these 1,100 city states were all competing with each other and developing new institutions and stuff like that. But the flip side of that competition is that they were constantly fighting and fighting wars and killing each other, which must have been immensely costly.
That's right. That is correct. During the years of prosperity, the Athenians, on average, were actually at war 2 out of 3 years. In the period 478 BCE to 338 BCE, they were actually at war 2 out of every 3 years. They never had actually a kind of a 10-year period of peace. So those interminable wars among the city-states were actually detrimental for Greece. You're not gonna invest if you think that your country is going to be raided. It's not worth actually thinking long run in terms of human or non-human capital if those resources are going to be destroyed by an enemy raid. And if we look at capital as such, if you do not invest in capital because you do not expect that you will bear the fruits of that capital for a long time to come, then obviously you end up with a very high labor to capital ratio. So labor becomes cheap, and therefore you have the second round event that you don't want to use capital anymore. So you may go back and say, now I can explain why they were relying on slaves instead of trying actually to rely on machines. Remember what you said before about the Industrial Revolution in Britain? Labor is very expensive. That gives me the incentive, because I want to make a profit, to find actually cheap substitutes. I can use the energy sources that I have, the coal, which is there. Right? So I sit down and invent a new technology to use coal. Now, if labor is very cheap because there is abundant labor in comparison to very rare capital, then why bother? I will raid, I will get slaves, and that's it. I will carry on with the same method of technique of production. These things actually come to say that you can look at slavery not as a cause of, not as a causal factor in the ancient economy, but as a response to fundamental economic problems. In other words, slavery and low technological progress are both of them symptoms of the fundamental factors of expensive energy and interminable wars.
Yeah. And of course, a lot of the incentive to make war would be because you could get this benefit if you won of taking slaves. So wars didn't. I think in the modern era, a lot of times war is defensive or preventative, but not generally very profitable in terms of going and getting resources from your enemy. But certainly in pre-modern times and in ancient Greece, you really could get rich by winning a war or a campaign or even just a particular battle.
Yes, and war is inefficient, but it is not irrational. So to go back to the questions about rationality, say they were actually warring while they were spending, in fact, wasting resources. Well, from their point of view, it was not a waste of resources. It was a way of getting actually rich. So war is inefficient because it destroys resources. But those who acquire the lower resources than before are actually richer than before. So for them, it was rational. There is rationality in war, in war making.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, that's why it's so common throughout history.
Yes.
So we're running low on time. Do you have any concluding thoughts or any sort of big picture ideas that you want the audience to come away with having listened to this conversation?
Yes, the obvious answer is that yes, I do, and that is to say that this is I consider it as a very exciting area of research. Why ancient Greece did not industrialize, and I think that there will be a lot more contributions into that. It is not something which is a closed issue. We learn more and more as we bring actually a number of disciplines in ancient history, economics and law, and we move into something like a holistic approach to in the way that economists now realize that development is not just an economic issue, an economic phenomenon. Then looking at the history and the performance of ancient Greece is not an issue just for recording the past, but it is an issue which can be analyzed by using economics as well as politics, or the methodology of economics and politics.
And on that note, my guest today has been George Tridimas. George, thanks for being part of Economics Detective Radio.
Thank you very much for having me. Really honored.
That concludes this episode of Economics Detective Radio. The discussion question, which we'll be discussing in the Facebook group Economics Detective on Facebook. The discussion question is, which of the factors we discussed do you think, according to your intuition and your understanding of history and economics, which do you think is the biggest or the most plausible factor in reducing the likelihood of an industrial revolution in ancient Greece? So, to recap, we talked about energy, we talked about culture, we talked about institutions, political institutions, things like democracy and the death of democracy with Alexander's conquest of Greece, and we talked about the cost of constant warfare. So which of those do you think is the biggest factor that stopped Greece from continuing to grow after after 300 BCE? So if you want to join the discussion, if you want to give an answer to that question or see what other people have to say, go to Economics Detective on Facebook. It's a closed group. You need to request entry and join the discussion.